Hi, everybody. Good to see you this evening. And here we are tonight, November 9th. The cold weather has kicked in, and wow, this has been good. Don't you like the cold air? I sure do, and looking forward to the cool weather after, especially after that heat wave we had on Labor Day, but in September. So, looking forward to getting into the study with you tonight. We're still in Revelation chapter 20, and we've already examined last week. We looked at that 1,000-year period that Revelation 20 verse 4 describes Jesus reigning for 1,000 years, and we looked at the controversy surrounding that 1,000 years, and is it just a long period of time? And if it is a long period of time, are we in the millennium right now, as many teach in the church, and many scholars teach that, hey, we're in the millennium right now. They call it the amillennial reign of Christ, the realized millennium. It's happening right now. And then, of course, there's a post-millennial view, which says, well, maybe we're not in the reign of Christ yet, but when it does come, he'll reign for either 1,000 years or a long period of time. Then he'll come back. It gets a little confusing. But then, of course, there's the view that Calvary Chapel holds, and that is that the millennium hasn't started yet. We're still waiting for it to take place. There's got to be this tribulation period, this 7-year tribulation. Amillennialism and postmillennialism doesn't really believe in a tribulation, a 7-year tribulation. And so that's where we're at right now. We've been looking at this 1,000 years. We looked at the controversy last week, and now this week we're going to be looking at, well, what takes place during the 1,000-year reign of Christ? What does it look like? And so that's what we're going to look at tonight. Well, of course, in Revelation 19, we saw the Antichrist, the false prophet, thrown into the lake of fire after Armageddon, and I assume before the 1,000-year reign of Christ. And then, of course, Satan, at the beginning of chapter 20, in the first 3 verses, we see Satan bound and cast into the abuso, or the bottomless pit, where he'll be held bound there for 1,000 years. And then what takes place after Satan is bound? I believe, and this is speculation, but I believe that there's a judgment of the mortal Jews and a judgment of the Gentile mortals that survive Armageddon, and they will be judged, and they will be separated into 2 groups, and one of those 2 groups will be allowed to populate the millennial reign of Jesus Christ, and actually have children during the 1,000-year reign. Now we come to the 1,000-year reign, and tonight, and what does it look like? What does God's kingdom on earth, what will it look like? And of course, this is the premillennial view that we believe that is still yet future. And so let's take a look at what the Bible has to say about this 1,000-year reign of Jesus that we read about in Revelation 20, verse 4. Well, of course, when we talk about the kingdom, we are reminded of the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples to pray. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, and thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This kingdom that we're praying for is a future kingdom that we're asking God, please send that kingdom so that your perfect will can be done here on earth as it is done in heaven. Of course, right now we know that God is sovereign and that his will be done regardless of evil. But we do know that one day that Satan, who's the ruler of this world, is going to be thrown out, as we saw there at the beginning of Revelation 20, first 3 verses, bound and cast into the bottomless pit. And then Jesus will begin, he will fulfill this passage right here where his kingdom will come to earth and he will rule and reign. Of course, this is what he wants us to pray for. He wants us to ask God, please send your kingdom so that you can reign here and your perfect will be done. So this is how we are to pray, and thy kingdom come. Now, we learned from, as we saw in the past couple of weeks, Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, we see one of the most amazing prophecies in Scripture given concerning the chronology of the coming of Jesus. And we know verse 24 of Daniel 9 explains to us that there are 6 promises that will be fulfilled in order for the kingdom to come. And those promises will be fulfilled at the end of this 490-year prophecy, which you'll check last week's out. We went into this in more detail. I'm not going to do that tonight. But 490 years will pass, and that will actually end the 7-year tribulation. And at the end of the 7-year tribulation, 6 things will take place. God will finish the transgression. He'll put an end to sin. He'll atone for wickedness. And this is all concerning Israel. This is about notice he says, your people. 77s are decreed for your people, for Israel. So the focus here is Israel, and this is what's going to happen for the Jews, for Israel, and for Jerusalem, is a finish of transgression, put an end to sin, atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and then finally to anoint the most holy. These 6 things will take place before the start of the 1,000-year reign of Christ. So there you have it. And when we think of these 6 promises that will usher in the 1,000-year reign and hit the coming of his kingdom, we expect that with this there will be peace. There's our dove coming with the olive branch, peace on earth, and then Jesus will begin his 1,000-year reign. So let's go ahead and get started tonight. We're going to look at that 1,000 years. What does it look like? And is it something that is happening today? No. The manifestation of God's kingdom is not on earth. Even though there are many in the church who say, well, yes, it's here, it's just that it's invisible, that we can't see it. The kingdom, and many are even praying to bring the kingdom to come to earth through their efforts somehow without Jesus coming back. They can't do that. They can't bring heaven to earth while Satan is the ruler of this world until Jesus kicks them out, binds them, throws them out for 1,000 years, and then he will bring the prayer of the Lord's Prayer will be answered at that time, and his kingdom will come. Now, the manifestations of what that looks like is important for us to understand, and much of it is described for us in the Old Testament, and it provides details of what God's coming kingdom will look like. And so I want to go over 7 of those manifestations with you. And first of all, and first and foremost, God's kingdom is going to be visibly seen, fully manifested, after Israel is in the land of promise, and is a great nation and blessing all the families of the earth. And this is per God's unconditional promise to Abraham and his descendants, as outlined in Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3. And so we'll ask the question, and I'm going to ask you a series of questions as we go through each of these points about the manifestation of God's kingdom on earth. And if the answer to these questions are no, then his kingdom hasn't been manifested on earth. He cannot visibly see it yet. So, for example, does Israel have total control over all the physical land promised to them by God? You see, part of the Abrahamic covenant is found in Genesis 15, verse 18, where we read about the boundaries of the land that God promised to Israel, from the river of Egypt all the way up to the Euphrates River in northern Syria, and that has been promised to Israel. Do we see Israel in control of that land today? Of course we don't. And so we know that's not true. That isn't happening. So we know, well, in that respect, the kingdom isn't manifested yet. Here's another question. Is Israel currently blessing all the families in the earth? That's Genesis 12, verse 3, that promises that Israel will, the descendants of Israel, the Jews, through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, will bless all the families of the earth. Is that happening today? Is it currently happening? No, it is not. So that is evidence that the kingdom hasn't been physically manifested. Let's go to the second point about God's physical manifestation. God's visible kingdom on earth will be revealed with his forceful wrath. Now that raises the question, has this been fulfilled in the past? According to Psalm 2, God is going to, the kings of the earth are going to rebel against God, and they're going to resist the coming of his king to Jerusalem. And they are not going to want him here, but God's going to force him to come. In fact, I even think there's a warning there in Psalm 2 that you need to kiss the king if you want to have a good relationship with God, the king, of course, being Jesus. And then, of course, Revelation 6 through 19 describes the coming of the king in great wrath and in great force. Here's our question. In the past, have we seen God forcefully manifest his will on the earth? And we know in Revelation chapter 17 that 10 kings will be united under the Antichrist, and they'll actually fight Jesus, and there'll be a big battle between them and Jesus coming to take by force the earth to establish his reign. Has that happened in the past? Of course it hasn't. Here's another one. In the past, did all the nations gather against the city of Jerusalem to fight God? That's one of the prophecies that all the nations on earth. We read it in Zechariah chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, that the nations of the earth will be gathered there in Israel and Jerusalem. And verse 3 of Zechariah 14 tells us that Jesus will fight against them when they do come. And has that happened? Well, of course it hasn't happened. So that's another evidence against this idea that the kingdom has been fully manifested on earth. Here's another one. In the past, did God simultaneously judge all the nations in the valley of Jehoshaphat? We saw this last week with Matthew 25, 31 to 46, where the Gentile nations are judged. Has that happened? No, of course it hasn't. Joel 3, verse 2 tells us that the nations will be judged in the valley of Jehoshaphat, which is the valley just outside of Jerusalem, known as the Kidron Valley. Of course, when the Mount of Olives is split in two, that valley will be huge. It says a huge valley, and there they will be judged. And has that happened? Of course it hasn't. So I'm going to add these questions as we go through them and ask them in the context of these points. Has this been fulfilled? Look at the third point. God's kingdom will not be made visible to the world until all dispersed Jews are gathered back to the land forever under King David's rule. That's according to Ezekiel 37, 21 to 28. You read those verses. I challenge you to go back and read those verses, and there it makes it very clear that God is going to bring all the Jews back to the land, and their king will be over them will be King David. God is going to raise them back to resurrected King David, and he's going to rule over them. And it'll be forever. Has that been fulfilled? Of course not. Are all Jews of Israel back in the land today? And that's one of the main points here. All the Jews will be back in the land today. There's still 6 million Jews living in America. And according to this, the Jews will be back in the land under King David's rule. Fourthly, God's kingdom will become visible to the world after Israel becomes a kingdom of priests, living off of the riches of the Gentile nations. Now, I ask you, is Israel acting as a kingdom of priests today in Israel, being used of God to minister to the Gentile nations, and are they living off the riches of the Gentile nations? According to Isaiah 61 verse 6, that's supposed to happen. When God's kingdom has come and is manifested on earth, that will happen. Has it happened? Of course it hasn't. So that is no to this question as well. We come to the fifth visible manifestation after Jesus has built the temple in Jerusalem, and he's ruling both as king and priest. This will happen when Jesus the Messiah comes back, according to Zechariah 6:12 and 13, where the office of king and the office of priest will be united into one, and the king, the branch, who will then rule over the world. Has that happened? Is Jesus ruling as king and priest from the temple of Jerusalem today? Of course he's not. And sixthly, what about all the people on the earth worshiping, serving, and obeying God's Messiah, King Jesus, in Jerusalem? That's supposed to happen according to Isaiah 2:2-4, and Psalm 22:27-29. That's supposed to happen. Is that happening today? Of course, we do not see all the nations bowing to, worshiping, and serving Jesus today, the Messiah. Not happening. And then finally, our last point here concerning the visible manifestation of God's kingdom. Do we find world peace, perfect justice, and the knowledge of the true God a reality all over the world? Do we find that? According to Isaiah 9, verses 6 and 7, he comes, a child unto us is born, he's given, his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Prince of Peace, and he will come, and in his kingdom there will be peace, will be universal all over the world. Has that come to pass? Is there world justice? Is the world full of the knowledge of the true God today? Of course it isn't. So these are just real basic questions that we would ask concerning thy kingdom come. Has God's kingdom come to earth? Can we see it? Of course we can. Now there are many Bible scholars today that say the kingdom of God is here now and it's invisible and Jesus is ruling over the hearts of men, and it's just really too hard to take. I mean, you know, how they could take the Old Testament scriptures and spiritualize them and make them into metaphors and make them mean something that they don't. And this is just sort of a cursory overview of this. I want you to check those scriptures out that we went through. Go back and when you look at this, it's on. It'll be in the archive of the live stream. Check it out. Check these scriptures out and see if what I was teaching tonight is true. Now, what I'd like to do is go over a number of scriptures in the Old Testament, primarily in the Old Testament, that describe what the conditions of the earth will be like during the kingdom reign of Jesus, when he is reigning for 1,000 years. What are some of the conditions that will be unique to that 1,000-year reign of Jesus after Jesus returns to the earth to set up his kingdom? What will they look like? Well, first of all, God's presence in his sanctuary will be seen and will be known by all the nations. And we see this in Ezekiel 37:27 and 28, where he says, my dwelling place will be with them, I will be their God, that will be my people. Then the nations will know that I, the Lord, make Israel holy, when my sanctuary is among them forever. So what we see here is that the nations will see God dwelling there in the midst of Israel, and then they will know that in fact God is who he claims to be. And then we come to the second condition. There will only be one language, and there will no longer be many religions in the world when he comes back to rule. And so during that 1,000-year reign, according to Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 9, for then I will restore to the peoples. In other words, I will change the speech of the peoples to a pure or a holy language. So I will restore or change the speech of the people to a pure language, that they all may call on the name of the Lord to serve him with one accord. In other words, there will no longer be many religions, because they will serve the true and living God with one accord. There aren't many ways to God. Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam will be gone. There will no longer be any other worship of any false gods or any false religions. This will be the one true religion. And it's interesting that there'll be only one language. And so when you think about back to the Tower of Babel. Remember, they did speak one language at one time, and then God had instructed them to move all over the earth and populate the earth. And instead of scattering all over the earth and populating the earth, what do? They gather together in the region of there in what is today known as Iraq, and they built the city of Babylon, and they built a tower there to make a name for themselves. And how did God respond to that? He confused their languages. Well, according to this verse, when Jesus comes back, there's no longer going to be 6,000 plus languages. There's only going to be one language, and many believe that one language will be Hebrew. And so that's what Zephaniah 3 verse 9 is telling us, and that's what it's going to look like during the 1,000-year reign of Christ. There will only be one language, and it will be a language that will be used to praise God. It'll be a pure, holy language, and that they're using that language. They will call on the name of the Lord, and they will serve Him as one accord. That's all nations. So that's one of the things that 1,000 years is going to look like, the 1,000-year reign of Christ. One language, one religion. Then when we come to the third point, holiness in Israel will be witnessed worldwide as manifested through the king's subjects. We see this in Isaiah 4:3, and it shall come to pass that he, the Jew who is left in Zion, will be called holy. By who? By the nations. Everyone who is recorded among the living in Jerusalem. And so, when does this take place? Well, we read in verse 4, when the Lord has purged the blood of Jerusalem from her midst by the spirit of judgment, by the spirit of burning. And that, of course, is a reference to the coming of Messiah Jesus in Armageddon, when that great purge takes place during the tribulation. So this takes place after the tribulation, verse 3, and that's when the nations will recognize the Jews as holy, and then let's go to the fourth condition of the millennium. Teaching and instruction will come from the Lord's throne in Jerusalem to all nations. So Jerusalem is going to be like the capital of the world, and from there the teaching of Jesus, of the Lord, will go to all nations. We see this in Isaiah 2 and 3. It says, in the last days, and of course that's referring to the millennial reign of Christ, the Lord's temple will be established as chief among the mountains. The mountains is a metaphor here for nations. And all the nations will stream to it. So we're going to have nations from all over the world will be going to Jerusalem, which will be chief among the nations. And the Lord's temple will be there, chief among the nations. And is there a temple there today, by the way? No, not yet. When Jesus comes back, He will build the temple according to Zechariah 6, 12 and 13. But then verse 3 says, and many people will go up and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, and He will teach us His ways, so that we may walk in His paths, and the law will go forth from Zion, or that will be from Israel. A fifth condition in the earth during the millennium, the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord. We see this in Isaiah 11:9, that for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the seas. So we've got the knowledge of the Lord all over the world. The sixth condition, man will no longer be able to blame his father for his sins or say the devil made me do it. Remember Flip Wilson? The devil made me do it. Well, that's not going to happen anymore during the millennial reign of Jesus. According to Jeremiah 31, 29 and 30, in those days people will no longer say, the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. That's an allegory or a metaphor of the father's faults are passed on to their children. So the fathers, their sour grapes are passed on to the children, setting their children's teeth on edge. Instead, everyone will die for his own sins. The children won't be able to blame their parents for their sins. They'll die for their own sins. So whoever eats sour grapes, his own teeth will be set on edge. Then the seventh condition, the world will be filled with righteousness, justice, and peace. Isaiah 32:1, see, a king will reign in righteousness, and rulers will rule with justice. By the way, you'll be a ruler. We know that after we get our new bodies, we'll come back to rule and reign with Christ, and those who are faithful will be put in charge of cities, and you will be a ruler, and you will help Jesus reign in righteousness, and you will rule with justice. In verse 17 of the same chapter, the fruit of righteousness will be peace. The effect of righteousness will be quietness and confidence forever. So that's what happens with the fruit of righteousness. Peace is the result when there's righteousness, and that righteousness will actually come as a result of a righteous rule and ruling with justice. So the world will be filled with righteousness, justice, and with peace. Eighth condition, there will be no more war anymore. We see that in Isaiah 2 verse 4. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation anymore, nor will they train for war anymore. There'll no longer be war during this 1,000-year reign, because Jesus will be reigning from Jerusalem, and we will be enforcing the laws that Jesus has set up, that of course is based on the word that will come out of Jerusalem. Psalm 46 verse 9 tells us this. It says that He, God, Jesus, makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. This will, of course, all take place during the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Revelation 20, verses 7 through 9. We understand that at the end of the 1,000-year reign, after this perfect peace takes place, that Satan will be released for a short time to deceive the nations, and he will gather those who follow after him. Now remember, the nations will be made up of these children who came from those that survived the Armageddon, and they were the righteous ones. Jesus, remember last week, he 2 weeks ago, we looked at how he judges the mortal Jewish mortals and the mortal Gentiles. He divides them into two groups, and the righteous of those two groups are allowed to populate the 1,000-year reign of Christ, but they have children, and those children will have a free will to choose whether to rebel against God or be obedient. Well, it turns out that a lot of them will rebel against God when Satan is released. At the end of the 1,000 years, he's released for a short time to deceive these ones that come from these mortals, and they'll actually try to attack Jerusalem, but it's not going to work. This will be the last war, the last battle. Praise God for that. Aren't you glad? And then fire will come down from heaven and devour all of them, because they did not want to receive Jesus as their king. They rejected him. And that's what the scriptures tell us. Now, ninthly, the conditions on the earth during the millennium worldly sorrow will be replaced by joy. We see this in Isaiah 35:10. Joy, it says here, and those the Lord has rescued will return. Speaking of the Jews coming back to the land, they will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads, and gladness and joy will overtake them, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. No more sorrow for the Jew. No more Holocaust for the Jew. No more rejection by the nations for the Jew. And we also read in Jeremiah 31 verse 12, they will come and shout for joy in the heights of Zion. They will rejoice in the bounty of the Lord. There's going to be plenty for everybody to eat, and they will have lots of flocks and herds, and they will be like the land will be like a well-watered garden, and they will sorrow no more. And so there will be rejoicing instead of sorrow. The 10th condition, the effects of the curse of sin is removed from the animal kingdom. We see this clearly in Isaiah 11 verses 6 and 7. This is during the 1,000-year reign. The wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. Can you imagine? You got the the prey and the predator right there, living together side by side with no problems. The cow will feed with a bear. Their young will lie down together. And it says here, the lion will eat straw like an ox. Can you imagine a lion eating hay, eating alfalfa? That just doesn't make any sense, because they're definitely a carnivore. But when the 1,000-year reign comes, a lion will eat straw like an ox. They'll be vegetarians, no more carnivores, no more omnivorous animals. And then we come to the 11th condition. The effects of the curse of sin is removed from nature, resulting in a Garden of Eden effect. Right now, nature is cursed, and there's so many deserts out there, and there's not enough rain to take care of all the desolate areas. It says that once the curse of sin is removed, then there will be a Garden of Eden effect. We see this in Isaiah 51 verse 3. The Lord will surely comfort Zion and will look with compassion on all her ruins. He will make her deserts like Eden, her wastelands like the garden of the Lord, the Garden of Eden. Joy and gladness will be found in her thanksgiving and the sound of singing. And so he's going to change the deserts into what was like the Garden of Eden. 12th condition, humans will be safe around wild animals. We see this in verse 8 of Isaiah 11. The infant will play near the hole of a cobra, and the young child put his hand in the viper's nest. And it says, verse 9, they will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain. Who's they? The animals. The animals, they will neither harm nor destroy humans on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord. Why will animals not harm humans? Because they will have a knowledge of the Lord. And so that's interesting. Right now, their knowledge of the Lord is obscured, but when the Lord is here, present on earth, and Satan is bound and no longer creating havoc, the animals will be at peace, and there will no longer be the fear that were put on the animals in Genesis chapter 9. Remember, after the flood, Noah's ark settled down, God put the fear, I think it's Genesis 9 verse 6, he put the fear of animals, of men on the animals, and so that the animals would run from men out of fear. Well, he's going to remove that fear, and God is going to make it possible for animals, men no longer to be afraid of animals, and animals no longer afraid of men. The 13th condition during the millennial reign is that sickness is removed. We see this in Isaiah 33:24. No one living in Zion will say, I am ill, and the sins of those who dwell there will be forgiven. And so this is very important. There's going to be no sickness. And when there is sickness, it'll be healed right away. Jeremiah 30 verse 17, I will restore to you health and heal your wounds, declares the Lord, because you are called an outcast, Zion, for whom no one cares. That's all going to change. And their health and their wounds will be healed by the Lord. When Jesus came the first time and he was healing all the sick and healing those who had leprosy, the worst kind of sickness back in those days that you can have. I mean, you talk about COVID-19. Leprosy was like the scourge of the day, and there was no remedy to get rid of it. I mean, at least today we have vaccines that are on the horizon that will be taking care of COVID-19 and other flus and other sicknesses. But here's the thing. When Jesus is reigning in his 1,000 years, sickness is going to be healed just like this, just like it did when Jesus came the first time and he healed all the sick, and the lame walked and the blind see and the mute could hear, he was able to demonstrate what the kingdom will be like the first time he came. Remember, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Remember the announcement by by John the Baptist and then by Jesus, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and they were demonstrating to the people what the kingdom of heaven will look like when Jesus actually is reigning as their king. Well, of course, they didn't accept Jesus as their Messiah, so that was put on hold until they finally do. Israel and the Jews accept Jesus as their Messiah. Then all these things will come to pass, as we're reading about here. It says here the disabled will be healed. I just mentioned the lame and the blind. Isaiah 35, verse 4, so say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. That's a reference to the tribulation when Jesus comes to save them, when they call out for him to come. And then this is what he will do. The eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped, and the lame will leap like a deer, and the mute tongue will shout for joy. You see, there's going to be no deformities. Children that are born with defects, they'll be healed. It's going to be in the way as God had originally intended, and that'll be during the entire 1,000-year reign of Jesus. So this is one of the conditions that we can expect to see. We spend a lot of money on hospitals and doctors and medications today to try to at least take care of all these different diseases and sicknesses that are out there, and cancer. Think about cancer, how devastating it is to so many folks, and yet we do know that that'll be a thing of the past. There'll be no cancer during the 1,000-year reign of Christ. There'll be no flu. There'll be, and if there is if anything like that tries to manifest itself, it'll be dealt with immediately, and the healing power of God will be there throughout the 1,000-year reign. 15th condition, there is no longer any oppression by the wicked kings, for their scepter has been broken. We see this in Isaiah 14, 5 and 6. The Lord has broken the rod of the wicked kings, the scepter of the rulers, which in anger struck down peoples with unceasing blows, and in fury subdued nations with relentless aggression. Those kind of leaders will be gone. No more Kublai Khans, no more Stalins, no more Hitlers, no more Mussolinis, no more dictators, no more Saddam Husseins. They'll all be gone because Jesus will be reigning, and we will be reigning with him, and we will be overseeing his kingdom throughout areas of the world. 16th condition of the 1,000-year reign of Christ, children will be born with a rebellious sin nature that will lead to their destruction unless they repent. So the mortals that entered into the millennium under the reign of Jesus, the Jewish mortals and the Gentile mortals, they will have children, and their children will have sin natures, and they still could rebel. And if they do, it'll lead to their destruction, as we see in Jeremiah 31:29. It says here, everyone will die for their own sins, and this includes rebellious children. If they rebel against the Lord, that's just what it says. And there will be God will not tolerate rebellion against him. Now he'll be a dictator, but he's a benevolent dictator who is just and he's fair. Revelation 20, verses 7 through 9, of course, we touched on this. We know what's going to happen. These mortals, the children that are born from the mortals that enter in the millennium, they are going to rebel, as it says here in Revelation 27 through 9. When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison. He will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners. And by the way, it'll only be a short time. That's what it says. I don't have that here, but it'll only be for a short time. And it says here, they, the rebellious sinners, marched across the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of God's people. It's just sort of hard to believe how the world conditions can be so perfect. A perfect environment, everything perfect, plenty of food for everybody, no one dying of starvation, no homeless people living out in the streets. Everybody will have plenty, and yet they will still rebel against God. Now, it's hard to understand because today we live in such difficult conditions, and well, not compared to our grandparents and our great grandparents. They lived under much more difficult conditions than we live today. But the thing is that even with that in mind, and all the sicknesses and the things that we have to deal with today, those will be all in the past, and then the mortals that enter into the millennium will have almost a perfect environment, like the Garden of Eden, like the Garden of Eden, and like they'll experience something similar to Adam and Eve during this 1,000-year reign, and yet they'll still rebel against God, and they'll attack Jerusalem. I mean, can you believe that? It's hard to just comprehend how it's possible that they know that Jesus, who's reigning in Jerusalem and calling the shots, and he's sovereign, and he's the one that's made all of this possible, they'll still rebel. Well, it's because of that sin nature. That sin nature has to be dealt with. It's a spiritual thing. When the sin nature needs to be dealt a death blow, and that can only be done by the blood of Jesus as we accept him and recognize that it is what he did for us on the cross and made it possible for us to be delivered from that sin nature that wants us to rebel. And so, anyway, there you have it. The 17th condition that I'm covering, there's more, by the way, more conditions than what I'm covering here. I'm just sort of touching on a number of them. But it's interesting. It says that during the 1,000-year reign of Christ, there'll be an increased light in the world, no more need for daylight savings. Listen to this verse. Isaiah 30, verse 26, the moon will shine like the sun. The moon, can you imagine? The moon will shine like the sun, and the sunlight will be 7 times brighter. I don't think this is suggesting that you'll need, you'll need sunglasses with an extra powerful prescription to protect your eyes from the UV. That's not what's going on. I think what's going to happen is that the light, well, it won't be a problem. There won't be any darkness during the 1,000-year reign as we now understand darkness today. And it's going to be very different during the 1,000-year reign as far as the sun and the moon are concerned. It'll be like the light of 7 full days when the Lord binds up the bruises of the people and heals the wounds of the afflicted. Now, just because it says here that there's going to be full light 7 days a week doesn't mean there still won't be rain. There'll be rain. We know there will be rain. This isn't in my list here, but we know, for example, in Zechariah chapter 14, when they have the Feast of Tabernacles, actually they're going to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles every year in Jerusalem, and the Gentile nations will be expected, according to Zechariah 14, to go there. I believe it starts in about verse 15 or 16 there in Zechariah 14. And they'll go there each year to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. And it mentions Egypt. If Egypt doesn't do this, to go to honor the king and honor the Feast of Tabernacles, God's going to withhold rain. So we know there'll be rain, and there's another passage I want to show you that actually there'll be storms, and we'll come to that in just a moment. 18, they will build and live in their homes, and everyone will work, enjoying the fruit of their labors. We see this in Isaiah 65, 22 and 23. No longer will they build their houses and others live in them. This house that I'm in today, somebody lived in this house before us. Well, according to this, that won't happen during the millennium. They'll build a house, and they'll be able to stay in that house. They won't lose it. There won't be no foreclosures on that house. That's just the way it's going to be during the millennial reign of Jesus. Everybody's going to have a home, a roof over their head, and it says here, and they're going to they're going to plant and they're going to eat what they plant instead of planting and others come in and eat it. Apparently, each person is going to have their own house. They're going to have their plot of land. They're going to, just like Adam and Eve were supposed to take care of the garden, they'll tend the garden for their own home. It'll be like Adam and Eve in that respect. They'll live off the land. They'll live off the produce of their land, the fruit that they grow. They won't have to, we can't get by, so we better sell some of our produce in order to survive. That won't happen. And then it says, for as the days of a tree, so will be the days of my people. You know, a tree lasts for much longer than humans. I mean, there are trees in the Sierra Nevada, in Sequoia National Park. There are trees that are over 1,000 years old. There's some redwood trees that are 2,000 years old. In fact, the bristlecone pine there up near Lake Tahoe, they estimate has been around for 3,000 years, more than that. So we know that they're going to live longer during this time, and they're going to have their own homes and their own property, and they won't have to worry about losing their house and losing their land and so on. Verse 23, it says, they will not toil or in vain or bear children doomed to misfortune. You don't have to worry about a child with Down syndrome or a child with birth defects. It says here that they won't be doomed to misfortune. This is during the 1,000-year reign of Christ. They won't toil in vain. All the work that you do, it won't be in vain. You'll be prosperous in what you do. Of course, this is referring to the mortals. They will be prosperous during this 1,000-year reign. For they will be a people blessed by the Lord, and they and their descendants with them. A 19th condition, the door locks will no longer be necessary. You'll be totally safe. You'll be secure, living peacefully and quietly. Now there may be some hailstorms, and the cities will be humbled from time to time. It says here in Isaiah 32, 18 and 19, my people will dwell in a peaceful habitation, in secure dwellings, and in quiet resting places, though hail comes down on the forest and the city is brought low in humiliation. That will happen during the millennial reign, which indicates to me that there will still be weather. If there's hail, there'll still be storm clouds. I'm not sure about the tornadoes and hurricanes and what it means. The city is brought low in humiliation. Perhaps there will be some type of weather that will cause destruction for some cities. But you see, the nice thing about the millennium is that even though this devastation comes along, it'll be quickly repaired and quickly fixed, and death will be minimal during the 1,000-year reign, because Jesus will see to it that there'll be healing, there'll be any problems that exist. Jesus will see to it that those problems will be taken care of during this 1,000-year period, and we may well be part of that as resurrected saints that will be overseeing, some of us will be overseeing 5 cities, some 10 cities, maybe some 1 city. In fact, some may be only overseeing an apartment complex. I don't know, but we'll be overseeing areas that we will be responsible for. I don't think there'll be any apartments. Everybody will have their own home and their own property. And by the way, there's plenty of room on the earth to spread out. The deserts right now, when you travel from here, let's say, to Phoenix, there's so much desert there. I mean, you go see all that land. Well, that'll be arable land, and it'll be filled with pools of water and foliage and all kinds of fruit trees and so on. And so there's going to be plenty of room for people to spread out. There'll be no need for the inner cities anymore with the tall buildings and the apartment, squeezed in apartment where if you talk too loud, your neighbor will hear you through the wall. That won't exist during the 1,000-year reign of Christ. But there could be, according to this verse here, that there will be hail, and there will be some cities will be brought low in humiliation, suggesting that the weather could be a little tough, but people aren't going to die from it. That's what's cool about it. There's gonna be death having to do more with sinning and rebellion against God and against His laws. But let's go on to 20. We're on the 20th condition that I've. This is stuff that I came up with. I'm sure there's a lot more than this, but the length of life is going to be restored as in the time of Adam and Eve. Isaiah 65 verse 20 tells us, "Never again will there be an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not live out his years. He who dies at 100 years old, age 100, will be thought of as a mere youth, and he who fails to reach 100 will be considered accursed." Think about that. Think about what that means. If they're 100, they're considered like a 10-year-old. Well, that's sort of like in the days of Adam. We know that Adam lived to, Genesis 5:5 tells us that he lived to 930 years old. So let's say basically 1,000 years. If they're 100 years old and they live 1,000 years, that would be the same as somebody today living to age 100 and they're a youth at age 10. So we know that during the millennium, it's going to be similar to the way it was in the Garden of Eden. They will live longer, as we saw earlier, like a tree, a tree that we had talked about earlier. Psalm 90. Now, I want to address this a little bit. Now, 2,500 years after Adam, the life expectancy actually decreased to just a little bit over 100 years old. So by the time of Moses in 1450 BC, Moses lived 120 years and then he died. 120 years. That's a far cry from 930 years. If you put the life expectancy from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, you'll find that the life expectancy gradually drops, so that after Noah and after the flood, the life expectancy dropped down. By the time you get to Abraham, Abraham lived to 175, I believe it is, and so on. You can follow it by looking up look up Genesis 5, then skip over to Genesis, I want to say chapter 11, and there you'll get the genealogy of Abraham, and you'll see how the number of years have dropped. And then, of course, by the time we get to David, King David, we learn in Psalm 90, verse 10, "Our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures." So by the time of David, if you made it to age 70, you were living a full life. But because of strength, you make it to age 80. And whoever wrote this psalm, they said, "Yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away." That sounds like David. He had, during his prime years, he had a lot of sorrow, a lot of trouble. But you see, the thing is that when the 1,000-year reign comes, the life expectancy is going to go back up to, I believe, like the time of Adam, where they can live up to 1,000 years. So the kids that are born there at the beginning of the 1,000-year reign of Christ, they'll live through the entire 1,000 years. And a lot of them are going to end up rebelling against Jesus, which is fascinating to me. Think about the third of the angels. You see, they had perfect conditions in heaven. And yet a third of the angels rebelled against God. That's hard to fathom, isn't it? That you would rebel against the one who gave you breath, the one who gave you life, the one who's provided for everything that you have. Just think about it. Everything that you have is because of God. He is the one that has allowed you to have what you have. All of your material blessings, even the healing when you go through sicknesses, and He heals you of cancer, and He takes care of you and sustains you through this sin-filled world. It's because of Him. And so few want to acknowledge that. And praise God for that. They want to give all the glory to science and to doctors. And when it's God is the one behind these things. During the 1,000-year reign, It's going to be especially manifested over and over and over again. Yet still they will rebel. Um, 21st condition, capital punishment. The death penalty is going to be enforced. We see this in Isaiah 11:4. God, he's going to take care of the needy and the poor, and he's going to see to it that justice is delivered for them. And he's going to strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. This isn't just speaking of the tribulation in Armageddon, when he comes back in great wrath and by force to take out those in rebellion. This is going to take place during the millennial reign as well. If you rebel against authority, it's going to be quick. You're going to be taken out. There's going to be no prolonged court cases, where when there's some violent act is committed and it's being litigated 2 years later in court, and it just goes on and on and on, and justice isn't served quickly. That's not going to happen during the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Justice is going to come swiftly, and when there's any kind of breaking of God's laws, he's going to deal with it quickly. And that includes capital punishment. We read in Isaiah 29:20 and 21, the ruthless will vanish, and the mockers will disappear, and all who have an eye for evil will be cut down. And just an eye for evil. I mean, look at verse 21. Those who with a word make a man out to be guilty, who ensnare the defender in court, and with false testimony deprive the innocent of justice. This is good. This is the way it's going to be during the millennium. There's going to be conflicts, and there's going to be disagreements, but if you are the one responsible for making someone guilty through your words when they're not guilty, you're going to be dealt with quickly, and that, of course, is going to be true throughout the entire 1,000 years. And it says here, the ruthless will vanish, the mockers will disappear, and all who have an eye for evil, they'll be cut down, and it will happen quickly. They're not going like today. They're letting felons out of prison because there's not enough room for them in the prisons. Well, that's not going to happen when Jesus is reigning. Not going to happen. In fact, I don't even think there'll be prisons. I think that they'll be dealt with quickly. I mean, justice is going to happen quickly. And guess who the enforcers will be? We're going to be in our new bodies, indestructible bodies. And if they try to mess around with us, guess what? And it'll be just, and it'll be fair, and it'll keep the peace in the world, and there won't be any violence. People will be secure because, you see, justice will be enforced during the 1,000-year reign. It's interesting that when you talk about the 1,000-year reign of Jesus, you don't think of conflict, and you don't think of people having trouble with each other, but there's still going to be conflict, even in their perfect bodies. There's going to be the temptation to want to make somebody look guilty when they're not guilty, and if that happens, it's not going to be tolerated. And so we're going to see perfect justice carried out during the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and we're going to see swift justice carried out quickly. And in fact, I think that may have something to do with you and me. When we are reigning with Christ, we will be carrying these things out. And it's going to be done in a fair way, and it's going to be done in the context of who Jesus is and what he wants us to do according to his righteous word. And it's unfortunate that there are people out there who are just not going to want to do what God wants them to do. It's very sad, and that's true today. You look at what's going on today with all those folks out there that are just violent people. They're just mean, and they try to take justice in their own hands, and they end up causing more grief and trouble than really they should. The 22nd condition, now I'm going to end with this one. The earth will be renovated and not fully restored. And that's one thing I used to think when Jesus comes back, he's going to make everything perfect. But in fact, when he comes back to reign for 1,000 years, he's not going to make everything perfect. He's going to renovate the existing earth. It's going to be a total mess when he comes back after all of the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments, the water turning to blood and the mountains leveled and just all kinds of bad stuff on the earth. He's going to come back and renovate that and make it look like the Garden of Eden. He's going to restore the climate. Talk about climate change. There won't be any more climate change. He's going to make the climate perfect and perfect in the sense that we aren't going to have to worry about global warming and the seas rising too high or not having enough water. All of that's going to be there. Now, there are going to be variations, of course, with the weather, as we just read about the hail in the forests, and some cities will, in Egypt, he's going to withhold rain for them if they're not obedient. But Zechariah 14. But as a general rule, the earth is going to be really something beautiful. And I wish it was today. Today we've got the weather is getting more and more out of hand. But I believe it just has to do with the fact that we're getting closer to the return of Jesus. But during the 1,000-year reign, we know that when he comes back, he's going to renovate the existing earth, but he's not going to fully restore it. That doesn't happen until the new heaven and the new earth, when he makes everything perfect. But the 1,000-year reign is not going to be perfect. So here's an example of that in Ezekiel 47. Here he's writing in verse 8, Ezekiel's writing about what happens when the water flows from the temple. You see, the temple in Jerusalem will be up on a higher elevation, and there'll be a huge water reserve underneath Jerusalem, springs of water. You know, there's lakes of water underneath the ground, and that water is going to flow up and flow out of the temple. We read this in Ezekiel 40 to 48, right in there. It talks about how the water, I think it's chapter 47, where the water will flow. Yeah, it is right here. The water will flow from the temple down to the Dead Sea and down to the Mediterranean Sea. And that's what it says here. This water flows toward the eastern region or the Mediterranean Sea and goes down into the Araba. That's the desert area where it enters the sea. That would be the Dead Sea. And when it empties into the sea, the water there becomes fresh. Now, everybody knows the Dead Sea is dead. There's no life in it. It's 6 times saltier than the ocean. In fact, I got to go swim in the Dead Sea, and you actually float. It's so easy to float in the Dead Sea. You can't sink because your body just is not. There's so much salt and it causes buoyancy. But so this water is going to flow into the Dead Sea, and then it goes on to say in verse 9 of Ezekiel 47, there will be large numbers of fish because this water flows there and makes the salt water fresh. So where the river flows, everything will live. Fishermen will stand along the shore from En Gedi to En Eglaim. The fish will be of many kinds, like the fish of the Great Sea. Just like the Mediterranean Sea has many kinds of fish, so the Dead Sea will come to life and it'll have many fish. But then it says makes this curious statement, but the swamps and marshes will not become fresh, they will be left for salt. So, you know, the Dead Sea has salt all over the place. If you go down there and drive around the Dead Sea, you can see salt, especially toward the south end. You can see large structures of salt because it's so salty there. And so we know that the earth will be renovated but not fully restored because of conditions like it here in verse 11, that there'll still be swamps and marshes. And so this, so here we have I have a little topographical aerial photo of Jerusalem, and describing here in this map. We've got Ezekiel 47, 6 to 11. And we read, this is the Mount of Olives that's going to be split in two. Here's Jerusalem. And then here's the Kidron Valley, the valley that separates the Mount of Olives and Jerusalem. There's going to be an earthquake. There will be an earthquake. And Zechariah 14 tells us the Mount of Olives will be split in two. Half of it will move to the north, and the other half will move to the south. And there will be a great valley that will be formed here. This is the valley of Jehoshaphat, so I'm sure it'll extend to this great valley. And then the springs under Jerusalem, the water will flow from Jerusalem through this valley, and it'll end up going toward the Dead Sea. And I imagine they'll be able to see the Dead Sea from possibly from Jerusalem. I don't know, but the Dead Sea then will become filled with life. And we learned that as we learn, it'll be filled with all kinds of fish. Now, here's another map which shows the tribes of Israel. The land will be divided up according to Ezekiel 47. The land will be divided up among the tribes, and this is what this area right in here will be reserved for the prince. And there's Jerusalem. Here's Benjamin. Here's Judah. And Jerusalem, the temple, will be right about here. And then, according to Ezekiel 47, 6 to 11, there'll be water, and also Zechariah 14:8. Water will flow out to the Mediterranean Sea, and then water will flow to the east, to the Dead Sea, which will turn that sea into the Sea of Life. Wherever the river is, it'll become life. But in there will also be swamps and salt still there. So the topographical changes that affect the region, it's not going to be perfect. Okay. We're almost done here, but here is this is an aerial view of the Dead Sea in 1972, and you can see how this Dead Sea in the south is drying up. This is the southern part. Here's in 1989 what the same area. You can see how quickly the Dead Sea is drying up, and they're trying to save the water there. And then this is 2011. Now, what is the Dead Sea going to look like in the 1,000-year reign? Well, we know that we don't, it could be soon here, but we know, according to Ezekiel 47 and 6 through 11, the town of En-Eglaim down to En-Gedi, the water will flow from Jerusalem and bring life to that part of the Dead Sea, and then the rest of it will continue to be swamps and marshes. And then we know that this fits right in with what the scriptures have to say about Edom, which will become desolate forever. And so that area down in here, it sort of fits, will also be desolate, because Edom was in rebellion against God. Thus the land will be filled with demons. They'll be locked into that region. Also in Babylon, we're going to have a similar situation where the land is desolate. So the world is not going to be perfect. It'll be restored and it'll be renovated, but it won't be perfect. That won't happen until we get to Revelation 21. So next week we're going to take a look at what will take place after Jesus reigns for 1,000 years, and we will be getting into the great white throne judgment, and that'll be interesting, I think. So I look forward to seeing you next week. Father, Lord, we thank you for your precious word that you've given us, that you'll help us to just assimilate all of this, knowing that you have plans for the future and that involve the 1,000-year reign. And we now have a better idea of what that 1,000-year reign will look like, and how it is that what your reign will look like, and perhaps our involvement in that. And we thank you for that, Lord, and we give you now the rest this evening, the rest this week, that you may be glorified in our lives. Thank you for this blessing, Lord, and your word that you've given us.
When the time comes, we'll have a better understanding as to what's going on.